Hi, Sarah Pacaro, hypnotherapist and rapid transformational therapist. Today's video is going to be about codependency and where it comes from, how we become codependent, and what to do to break free from it. I imagine if you're watching this video that you are finding yourself in a situation where you're feeling stuck, you're feeling frustrated, and maybe you're like I was. I was in a very codependent, narcissistic relationship, my first marriage with a covert narcissist, got right out of that relationship and entered into another one immediately within less than a month with a malignant narcissist. Once I got to this point where I didn't want to live anymore because I was so depressed, so anxious, so stressed, so frustrated, and didn't see a way out, is when I finally discovered how to break free. And I'm going to share that with you at the end of this video. But one of the turning points with me was my ex narcissist, the second one, the malignant one. He was also an addict. He was also addicted to alcohol. And in an effort to save our relationship, after a couple of years of being together, he agreed to go to rehab and go to therapy. And so he goes into this rehab, spends tens of thousands of dollars to be in this rehab, really not to come out and be different or better. But I remember him getting home from rehab and telling me, "Hey, I've learned all about you. This is actually your fault." And I thought, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, you're an enabler. You're codependent. So yeah, this is all your fault. You enabled me. You allowed me to drink." And I'm thinking, what? And in the beginning, all of our problems were blamed on the alcohol. All of the things he said, all the ways he belittled me, put me down, lied to me, was because he was drunk. So this therapy and rehab he was going to fix all that. But of course, like narcissists do, they were never able to take responsibility. So he got out of spending tens and tens of thousands of dollars to come tell me that I was an enabler and I was codependent and it was my fault. I thought, wow, glad to see that therapy helped, but it did. I felt like I got punched in the stomach when he told me that I was an enabler, because the truth of it is that is the first time that anyone had ever told me I was an enabler. And after sitting with that, once the anger subsided, I thought, okay, what if you're right? What if it is me? And then I started to look at myself and realize it was me. If I was if I was an enabler and a codependent, what was it that took me to being that way? And I could see the truth in his statement. Even though I didn't like it, there was some truth in it. I was an enabler. I was a codependent. I was dependent on him in so many ways. And I wanted to be free from that, but I didn't know how. But the amazing thing is that I learned that if you were codependent, you're not born being codependent. You learn it. It's learned behaviors, learned traits. So I started diving into this world of codependency and read Codependent No More by Melody Beattie and all of these Brene Brown books. And they were all really helpful, but they didn't help me in unlearning it for myself. It just gave me more information, more awareness, and more knowledge about this term. So if you're a codependent, what it means is that you give more in the relationship than you receive. Yes, that was prevalent in both my marriage and this relationship, that you invest more emotional time, you invest more mental time, more physical time, taking care of the person in the relationship rather than taking care of yourself. And you give a lot more than they do. So you are doing for them way more and much more than they are doing for you. They're not spending that same emotional, physical time with you that you are wanting to with them. You care more about what other people think about you than you care about yourself. And I realized that this was true. All these codependent terms and languages, and I was learning about, and I realized that I was a people pleaser. And I was only happy, right, if I was like giving and making other people happy and smile and laugh, even though I didn't feel like I could do that myself, even though I didn't feel like internally I was a happy person. I put on this mask and this perception, this aura that I was, and I liked when other people were happy. And I always, always, always gave. And it was really difficult for me to receive or ask for help at all. So I just felt stuck. Because if you are an enabler, then you are codependent. And that was a tough pill to swallow, but a necessary pill to swallow. And why is that? Well, because codependents believe and have accepted that they're not good enough. And that's what I felt. That is literally what it came down to. I never felt like I was good enough. No matter how much I accomplished, how much I achieved, how many successes and wins I had, I dismissed them all. And I put other people's needs and their approval on me to this attachment that I was good enough. But it was such a short-lived feeling, such a short-lived experience. Just as quickly as it came, it went. I was still left feeling like, okay, well, what next? What now? And always wanting more and more and more and more and more outside of myself, because what I was feeling inside of myself was empty, just a shell of a person. And I realized I attracted energetically and vibrationally someone else with that same inner feeling, that same sense of self. I didn't feel like I was enough, and I attracted narcissists, people who didn't feel like they were enough, people who put on their masks to try and hide it. And inadvertently, I was wearing my own mask and I wasn't even aware of it. So, a codependent is a person who has been emotionally manipulated, emotionally abused, emotionally neglected as a child, and sometimes physically or sexually. So, if you have experienced any of those types of abuses, if you've experienced emotional abuse or abandonment, whether it's, physical abandonment, maybe growing up, your parent was gone all the time. My dad was gone all the time working. Emotional or physical abandonment, maybe you were given up for adoption. That comes up a lot in the clients that I work with. And they think, but I had great adoptive parents, but there's still that sense of feeling of abandonment from growing up, or these emotionally avoid experiences, or you were verbally abused, you were constantly put down, told, you're not as good as other people, maybe treated with indifference. We feel like that doesn't matter, but that makes a huge impact when you were treated with indifference and just felt like you didn't matter. You were there, but it wasn't really, you didn't really feel like you were there. It didn't matter that you were there or you weren't there. And more often than not, it's highly likely that this child who experiences all those feelings of neglect and abandonment or indifference grows up and becomes codependent and becomes a people pleaser or a fixer, because they attach that external feeling with their internal sense of self. And I realized that after I entered into that second narcissistic relationship, well, the second one being way worse than the first in many ways, and dove into trying to discover out why I was this way and where did this come from and how I got there, I realized that connection between my childhood and my past to my present. Those feelings were the same. The experiences, the situations were vastly different because I'm no longer a child. I was an adult now and had my own house, my own job, my own responsibility and friends. But I realized that what I learned about myself, what I experienced growing up, was now continuing to play in my adult life. I grew up feeling invisible. I grew up feeling that my feelings didn't matter. My voice was not to be heard. I was to be seen and not heard, and just not make any waves or ruffles. And I grew up feeling that I never belonged. I never felt like I belonged anywhere. Yet I felt like everyone else had their place, that everyone else knew where they stood, even though later I found out that wasn't true. But that's what I felt when I was a child, and I always just felt out of sorts and out of place. And that's how I felt with my friends. That's how I felt with uh, my position as a student growing up in school. I just felt like I was unnoticed all the time. And I was constantly learning this at home, but I didn't realize that all of this internal thoughts and beliefs I had about myself were what I was witnessing at home between my mom and my dad. This modeling outside of the school and friends, where I felt lost and didn't feel like I belonged, but I felt more safe with them because we were, the same age as my friends. But with my parents, I realized that they were modeling codependent behaviors. My mom was an enabler to my dad. And so when I started seeing that and learning about the patterns and the connections, it's like everything made sense. My mother was always investing a lot more emotional time into my dad and their marriage and their relationship, while my dad was never even there. He was out working and paying the bills. And my mom worked full time too. They both had full-time jobs, but the balance was off. Even though my mom worked full time as well as my dad was traveling all the time, and wasn't really home a whole lot, but when he was, it was my mother's responsibility to have dinner on the table at 5:30 or 6 o'clock, right when he got home. It was her job to cook, it was her job to clean, it was her job to do the laundry. And there was a total imbalance. It wasn't just it should have been more balanced. It should have been my dad's job. He took care of things, and my mother just stepped in to avoid conflict. And my dad would get mad if things weren't done in a certain way or a certain time. My mother didn't like yelling or didn't like being yelled at for obvious reasons, because it's painful to be yelled at. So she did everything in her power to avoid being yelled at, or to have my brother and I not get yelled at. And with that, she took everything off our plate. My brother and I didn't have any responsibilities. We didn't have to help out with the dishes or the laundry or the chores or anything. We just got to go like play with our friends. I mean, we were expected to do our homework and get good grades, but my mom took all the responsibility, and we would always leave and go play with our friends. My brother would play with his, and I would go play with mine. And I even learned that my mom would hand wash the dishes, and still does to this day, so that she can appear busy to avoid having any engagement or interaction with my dad, and still does that to this day with my stepdad. She was doting on him, and she was appearing busy all the time and always having something to do to avoid that face-to-face engagement and connection. So I realized that that's what I was witnessing at home. I was being taught different things about a woman's role, and I was a female, a woman, and I was seeing my mom's role and how she was with my dad, and being taught by my mother that I shouldn't be worried about, or I should be worried about men being angry at me, and I shouldn't make them or do anything that will make them angry or yell at me, and do everything in my power to make sure that these men are happy and seek their approval and get this external validation. I was learning that women should worry about keeping their men happy, and that their own feelings don't matter. I never saw my mom express her true emotions or feelings or ask my dad for help. She just took it all on herself. And I learned that it's not okay to ask for things, that I was to be quiet and keep my mouth shut and just appreciate what I have. And I shouldn't tell the truth, and I should just appease my dad. And I saw my mom appease my dad, and I learned that women should just appease men and keep quiet. And even telling a little lie or a half truth, that won't hurt, right? And that it's not okay to expect your partner to be equal or tell them when you're disappointed at all. So I realized that I was witnessing this constantly growing up, and that light bulb moment of no wonder I ended up in emotionally abusive and unavailable relationships, just like my mom did. And that I did everything in my power to avoid feeling like I disappointed my partner, that I let them down. And so I would go over and above and beyond. And even when I was upset, it wasn't okay to say anything. And I was learning to stuff all of this guilt, this shame, this anger, this resentment down. And that in my childhood, my upbringing, I was being groomed to think and behave and act and feel like a codependent does. And that my place was secondary to a man's. And I was to be down here and they were to be up here. Well, it's no wonder I entered into several narcissistic and toxic relationships, because I didn't feel that I had the place or right to do anything or say anything. And I learned that I needed to chase after a man's approval the same way that my mom did. I cannot tell you how many times said, Sarah, don't worry, you'll find a guy. If I told her about a breakup with a boyfriend, or, the divorce from my husband, don't worry, you'll find someone soon. It's okay. There's a guy out there for you. And I realized even that phrase made me think that I wasn't good enough. I wasn't okay if I wasn't with a guy or in a relationship. So it's no wonder that growing up and hearing that and seeing that and experiencing that year after year after year, that I became a codependent myself and an enabler, just like my mother. Eventually, my dad ended up leaving because my mom was so boring and she wasn't exciting. And he left for someone that he had an affair with at his work, at his office. And my mom kept quiet about that whole thing. She was just worried about keeping things together, and she was busy suppressing her feelings, all the while teaching my brother and I to do the very same thing, because she was so worried about what was going on outside of her and didn't open up, wasn't vulnerable, didn't share with us. We had no idea why they got divorced until years and years and years later. And this led to my mother getting physically sick, really, really ill. And I see and know now as a therapist that that was a protective mechanism. When she was sick, she got strep throat all the time. She was always ill. She could go lie in bed and not be expected to do anything because she didn't feel good. And then when she started to feel better, she would come take care of everything, all the things that had piled up when she had that break. And that getting sick was the only way that she could get a break. So now realizing this stuff, I can see so clearly how it led to me being extremely hypervigilant. Those connections to my internal self were completely shut off. It was like they were an on-off switch and they got turned to off. And I hated being at home growing up. I loved going to other friends' houses. I never ever wanted to be at my house or invite other friends over to my house because it was always so uncomfortable. Even if a friend growing up had a toxic environment, I preferred to be there than at my own home, because at home, I always had the feeling of doom and gloom and walking on eggshells, and I hated it. So growing up, I did everything I could to get away from it. And that's why, I entered into my first marriage at 21 years old, and I moved to a different state with this guy that I thought was amazing. It was all to get away from home. And I never knew growing up what mood my dad was going to be in coming home. And I hated the sense of quietness, the inability to express myself. It impacted all of my friendships, all of my relationships growing up. I had very few friends because I was always told that I was so shy and so quiet, and was always asked what was wrong with me, even to the point that growing up in elementary school, every year when we had to get our hearing tests, uh, my teachers put me first and always said that they thought something was wrong with my hearing because I never spoke up. And the reason why I didn't speak up in class is maybe because I couldn't hear well what they were saying. And that wasn't it at all. I could hear perfectly fine. It was because at home I was taught that when I spoke up, I got in trouble. I didn't feel safe to speak up at home. And what I learned was that being quiet kept me safe. Being quiet and not saying anything protected me. And I became hyper vigilant and learned that when I stayed quiet and just observed and watched other people, I could calculate and I could predict what was going to happen next. And I could do that and did that to avoid getting into the crossfire, to avoid getting hurt, because our mind is hardwired to take us towards pleasure and away from pain. So I realized that there was more pleasure in not speaking up, and there was pain in speaking up, because then I would get yelled at, I would get criticized, I would get belittled. So in my therapy, that is what we uncover. The same, probably similar story, of course, your own unique experiences, that we all have this internal programming that's installed and established in childhood. These learned patterns and beliefs about ourselves, and these protective mechanisms that we develop to move towards pleasure and avoid pain. And my enabling codependent mother and highly controlling, emotionally unavailable father, who I always walked on eggshells around to avoid getting yelled at, taught me these patterns and beliefs. And as an adult, I had to unlearn them, reprogram, rewire. Codependency is learned. It's learned from seeing the behaviors, the traits of your caregivers and your parents. And I knew that my mom was afraid of my dad. I knew that something was off, but she had to follow his lead to avoid getting yelled at and to keep the peace at home. And she says that she wanted to because she loved my brother and I, yet she wasn't there emotionally because she was so externally worried about what was going on. And all those things that I learned led to failed marriage, led to really toxic and unhealthy relationships, led to my own personal unhappiness, experiences and bouts with depression and anxiety, because I was born to parents who didn't have the ability to give me what I needed emotionally, who didn't have the ability to see me, to see that I was in pain, see that I was struggling, because they were so wrapped up in their own internal struggles and internal pains, so wrapped up in their own head. My mom wrapped up in her head of keeping quiet, keeping the peace, and my dad wrapped up in his head with the frustration of being, quiet and having a boring household. That all of that stuff that I learned, I took into adulthood. And it's not normal or healthy to stuff your feelings, but as a child, that's what you learn, and that's what you have to do to survive childhood. So as an adult, you need to relearn. You need to learn to parent yourself and give yourself the things that your emotionally immature and unavailable parents taught you and programmed you with. So if you were interested in rapid transformational therapy, interested in hypnosis, and the 6-week journey that I take my clients on to undo that programming, undo those codependent enabling behaviors, because you're seeing now that they impact every area of your life and you're ready to break free from that, then I would love to connect. There's more information in the link below this video in the description about rapid transformational therapy and visiting my website. You can schedule a free consultation for us to connect and talk more about what it would be like to work one-on-one. So thank you for listening to my story, my journey. I hope some of this resonates with you, and I look forward to hopefully connecting soon to help you break those inner patterns and beliefs.